There is a moment in every relationship when you discover that trust was not as secure as you believed. And what makes betrayal so powerful is that the damage rarely comes from one single action. It comes from the meaning behind that action. It tells you something about how the other person handled your vulnerability, your loyalty, your patience, and the opportunities you gave them to do better. And this is where the avoidant often misunderstands what actually happened. They may believe they simply created distance. They may tell themselves, I needed space. They may convince themselves that withdrawing was necessary, that avoiding difficult conversations was better than confronting them, or that keeping their emotions under control protected both people. But there is a difference between needing healthy space and repeatedly damaging someone's sense of emotional safety. Space can preserve a relationship. Avoidance can destroy one. When someone trusts you, they are giving you access to something you cannot demand from them. They are allowing you to see parts of themselves that they don't show everyone. They are believing, often without guarantees, that you will handle that vulnerability with care. And when that trust is betrayed, the person doesn't simply become angry. Their entire internal understanding of the relationship can collapse. Suddenly, they begin questioning everything. Was the affection real? Were the promises real? Did those moments of connection actually mean what I thought they meant? Why did I keep giving chances? Why did I ignore the signs? This is why betrayal can have such a profound psychological effect. It doesn't only attack the present, it forces a person to reinterpret the past. And the avoidant may not understand this immediately because emotionally distancing themselves can become a way of avoiding consequences. If they don't look too closely at your pain, they don't have to confront what caused it. If they don't ask difficult questions, they don't have to hear difficult answers. If they withdraw before the emotional intensity becomes uncomfortable, they can maintain the illusion that nothing has really been lost. But eventually, reality catches up. Because you can escape a conversation. You cannot permanently escape the consequences of your behavior. Maybe you were the person who kept trying to understand them. You gave them explanations when they couldn't explain themselves. You gave them room when they became overwhelmed. You tried to communicate instead of attacking. You waited when they needed time. Or you believed there was something underneath the coldness that was worth reaching. And they may have interpreted all of that as evidence that you would never leave. That is one of the most dangerous assumptions anyone can make about another human being. Never confuse someone's patience with unlimited tolerance. Never confuse someone's love with permission to repeatedly hurt them. And never assume that because someone stayed through your worst moments, they are obligated to stay forever. There is a philosophical principle here that applies far beyond relationships. Every action teaches people how to treat you, but every repeated action also teaches them what they should expect from you. If you repeatedly betray someone's trust and they repeatedly remain available, you may begin believing that there is no real consequence. Until there is, and when that consequence arrives, it can feel sudden to you even though it was developing slowly inside them for months or even years. That's the part many people don't see. The relationship may appear to end on the day someone finally walks away, but emotionally, the ending often began much earlier. It began with every unanswered message, every broken promise, every unexplained disappearance. Every moment when they needed reassurance and received distance instead. Every time they were made to feel as though wanting basic emotional consistency was somehow asking for too much. Eventually, something changes inside them. They stop asking, they stop explaining, they stop trying to convince you. And perhaps most importantly, they stop expecting you to become the person they hoped you would be. That is the real collapse of the relationship. Because once expectations disappear, chasing disappears with them. And when the chasing stops, the avoidant can suddenly experience something they were not prepared for. The absence of emotional access. The person who once wanted answers no longer needs them. The person who once waited is now moving. The person who once tried to repair the connection is now repairing themselves. And that's when betrayal reveals its greatest consequence. You didn't simply lose their trust. You lost a version of them that was willing to keep believing in you. You cannot demand that version back. You cannot negotiate someone into trusting you again. You cannot use distance, charm, affection, or temporary attention to erase what their nervous system learned from repeated disappointment. Trust is built through consistency. And once consistency is broken enough times, apologies alone cannot rebuild it. So if you are listening to this and you have been betrayed, understand something. Their betrayal does not define your worth. It defines the choice they made when they were given something valuable. And your responsibility now is not to make them regret it. Your responsibility is to make sure the betrayal does not become the reason you betray yourself. Sometimes the greatest consequence of losing your trust is realizing too late that it was never replaceable. One of the most dangerous misunderstandings in any relationship is the belief that because someone keeps forgiving you, they will keep accepting you. Those two things are not the same. Forgiveness is an act of emotional strength. Acceptance of repeated disrespect is something entirely different. And this is where the avoidant can completely misread the person in front of them. You may have been patient because you understood that they struggled with vulnerability. You recognized that emotional closeness could overwhelm them. You didn't immediately judge every withdrawal. You gave them another opportunity because you believed that underneath the defensiveness, there was a person who cared. But there is a psychological limit to how much uncertainty a person can tolerate before uncertainty becomes exhaustion. At first, you ask questions. Then you start making excuses for them. Then you start lowering your expectations. And eventually, something inside you becomes quiet. That's the part people often misunderstand. The end of someone's patience doesn't always arrive with an explosive argument. Sometimes it arrives as emotional silence. You stop trying to convince them. You stop explaining why something hurt. You stop asking why they disappeared. You stop negotiating for basic consideration. Not because you suddenly stopped caring, but because you finally understood that caring cannot substitute for reciprocity. Think about what happens when someone repeatedly experiences the same pattern. They reach out and you pull away. They communicate and you shut down. They ask for clarity and you give them ambiguity. They attempt to repair the relationship and you create more distance. Eventually, the brain begins to recognize the pattern. And human beings are meaning-making creatures. We don't just experience behavior, we interpret it. If someone repeatedly walks away when you become vulnerable, you eventually stop interpreting that behavior as a temporary problem. You start interpreting it as information. You begin to think, this is who they are with me. That realization can change everything. The avoidant may believe your patience means the relationship is safe from consequences. But patience isn't an unlimited resource. Emotional energy is finite. Trust is finite. Attention is finite. Even love, despite everything people say about its unconditional nature, exists within the boundaries of human behavior. You can love someone deeply and still decide that their behavior is no longer acceptable. That isn't cruelty, that's maturity. And this is where personal boundaries become powerful. A boundary isn't a threat designed to control another person. A boundary is a decision about what you will participate in. You are not saying you must behave differently. You're saying, if this behavior continues, I will behave differently. That's a completely different psychological position. The first tries to control them. The second takes responsibility for yourself. And when you reach that second position, the entire dynamic changes. You no longer need the avoidant to understand your pain before you protect yourself from it. You no longer need their agreement before you establish a standard. You no longer need an apology before deciding that you deserve consistency. This is where many people become trapped. They spend months trying to get the other person to admit what they did. They want acknowledgement. They want an explanation. They want the person who hurt them to finally say, you're right, I should have treated you differently. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But your healing cannot depend on another person's emotional intelligence. Because if your peace requires their understanding, you've handed them control over your peace. The deeper lesson is that forgiveness should never require self-abandonment. You can release resentment without reopening the door. You can understand someone's wounds without volunteering to become the place where those wounds are repeatedly inflicted. Maybe the avoidant didn't realize what your patience meant. Maybe they thought you would always return. Maybe they assumed that because you had forgiven them before, you would forgive them again. But people eventually reach a point where forgiveness no longer means returning. It means letting go. And that is the moment they may finally recognize what they took for granted. They may remember how accessible you once were, how willing you were to communicate, how many times you tried to understand instead of judge, how many opportunities existed to repair what was broken. But now something has changed. You have changed. And when you change the standard by which you participate in a relationship, the other person has to confront a new reality. They can no longer rely on the old version of you. That's why your greatest move isn't proving that they hurt you. It's becoming someone who no longer needs to be hurt repeatedly before choosing themselves. Because the goal isn't to punish the avoidant. The goal is to stop punishing yourself for loving someone who wasn't ready to meet you where you stood. Let that distinction sink in. You don't have to become cold. You don't have to become bitter. You don't have to stop believing in love. You simply have to stop confusing love with unlimited access. Your patience was never a promise to stay. It was a gift. And gifts lose their meaning when they're treated as guarantees. There is a profound difference between silence that comes from weakness and silence that comes from clarity. And when you finally understand that distinction, you realize why your silence can communicate more than every argument you ever had. For a long time, you may have believed that if you could just explain yourself better, they would understand. If you could find the right words, maybe they would finally recognize what their behavior was doing to you. So you explained. You asked questions. You expressed your disappointment. You gave them opportunities to respond. And perhaps every time the emotional intensity increased, they moved further away. That creates a painful psychological cycle. You pursue clarity. They pursue distance. You become more emotionally expressive because you're afraid of losing the connection. They become more emotionally withdrawn because they feel overwhelmed by the intensity. Then you pursue even harder because their withdrawal makes you feel even less secure. And suddenly, both people are reacting to fear rather than acting from wisdom. But eventually, something changes. You stop chasing. You stop sending the extra message. You stop checking whether they have seen what you wrote. You stop trying to decode every silence. And perhaps most importantly, you stop trying to convince someone to care about what you already know. Matters now understand what happens psychologically. When that occurs, the avoidant is no longer receiving the emotional reaction they may have become accustomed to. There is no argument to escape from. There is no repeated explanation to dismiss. There is no emotional pursuit that allows them to focus on your reaction instead of their behavior. The distraction disappears. And when the distraction disappears, self-confrontation becomes possible. This is not about manipulating someone with silence. That's a crucial distinction. Strategic silence designed to provoke jealousy or anxiety is still a form of emotional control. But genuine silence, the kind that comes from accepting reality, is different. It says, I have communicated what I needed to communicate. I cannot force you to understand, and I will no longer abandon myself trying. That is strength, and strength often looks surprisingly quiet. We live in a culture that rewards constant reaction. Someone hurts you, and you're expected to respond immediately. Someone ignores you, and you're expected to demand an explanation. Someone disrespects you, and you're expected to prove that you're not weak. But emotional maturity doesn't require you to react to everything. Sometimes the most powerful response is to observe. Observe what they do. Observe what they repeat. Observe what happens when you stop rescuing the relationship from the consequences of their choices. Because behavior becomes incredibly clear when you stop interrupting the pattern. If you constantly repair the damage someone creates, they may never fully understand the cost of creating it. If you always return after they withdraw, they may never experience what permanent loss feels like. If you repeatedly accept the same behavior, they may assume that your boundaries are negotiable. But when you step back, not to punish them, but to protect your own peace, the responsibility returns to where it belongs, on them. Now they have to decide what their actions mean. Do they want to repair what they damage? Do they want to communicate honestly? Do they want to take accountability? Or do they simply want the comfort of knowing you're still available? Those are very different things. And this is where silence becomes revealing. Because when you stop speaking, you don't necessarily lose your voice. You remove the noise. You create enough space for reality to become visible. Maybe they reach out. Maybe they don't. Maybe they apologize. Maybe they remain defensive. Whatever happens, you learn something, and sometimes the truth you discover is more valuable than the answer you were desperately trying to obtain. You discover that you can survive uncertainty. You discover that you can live without constant reassurance. You discover that your identity doesn't depend on whether someone chooses you. And you discover that peace feels very different from emotional obsession. This is why your silence should never be about making the avoidant suffer. If your entire strategy depends on them feeling pain, you're still emotionally attached to their reaction. Real freedom is when their reaction becomes secondary. You don't walk away hoping they'll chase. You walk away because you finally understand what you need. You don't stop contacting them because you want them to panic. You stop because you refuse to keep negotiating with inconsistency. You don't become emotionally unavailable to teach them a lesson. You become emotionally disciplined because you have learned yours. And that transformation can be profound. The person who once needed an explanation now trusts their observation. The person who once needed closure now creates closure. The person who once waited for someone else to validate their worth now understands that worth isn't something another person grants. And if the avoidant eventually recognizes what they've lost, that recognition belongs to them, you don't need to engineer it. You don't need to monitor it. You don't need to wait for it, because your healing begins the moment your life stops revolving around whether someone else finally understands your value. That's the paradox of silence. When you stop speaking to be understood, you may finally become able to hear yourself. Silence becomes powerful when it is no longer a weapon against them, but a commitment to yourself. And this brings us to something most people misunderstand about emotional distance. There is a tremendous difference between having space and actually losing someone. An avoidant person may become comfortable with distance because distance can create a sense of control. When emotions become intense, stepping back can feel like relief. There is less pressure, fewer difficult conversations, and less vulnerability to manage. From their perspective, space may feel like safety, but space only works when there is still a relationship underneath it. When you have emotionally moved on, distance becomes something entirely different. It becomes absence. And that distinction can be difficult for someone to understand until they experience it firsthand. Think about what happens when a person has become accustomed to your availability. They may not contact you every day, but somewhere in their mind exists an assumption if they need you, you are there. If they decide to reconnect, you'll probably respond. If they become distant for a while, eventually things will return to normal. That assumption creates psychological comfort. They don't necessarily feel like they've lost you because they believe access remains available. And as long as access remains available, there may be very little urgency to confront what their behavior has actually cost. This is why genuine emotional withdrawal can be so revealing. Not manufactured silence, not games, not disappearing for 3 days to provoke a reaction. I'm talking about something much deeper. The moment you genuinely stop organizing your life around another person's emotional availability. You stop waiting for the message. You stop checking whether they are online. You stop interpreting every song, post, story, or coincidence as a hidden signal. You stop wondering whether today is the day they finally realize what they did. Your attention returns to your own life. And that is when the dynamic changes, because the person who once assumed you were emotionally standing still discovers that you have continued moving. This is psychologically significant because human beings often recognize the value of something more clearly when its availability changes. We can become accustomed to almost anything that is consistently present. The mind normalizes what it repeatedly receives. Your attention became normal. Your affection became normal. Your patience became normal. Your willingness to repair became normal. And what becomes normal can become invisible until it disappears. Suddenly, the same things they once overlooked become memories. They remember how you listened. They remember how you showed up. They remember the conversations they didn't appreciate. They remember the opportunities they were given. But there is an important point here. Their realization is not your objective. Your objective is freedom. Because if you leave only to make them chase you, you haven't actually left emotionally. You're still waiting. You're still measuring your worth through their response. Real detachment is different. Real detachment says, whether you return or not, I am moving forward. That is an incredibly powerful psychological position because it removes the need to control the outcome. You are no longer trying to force them into commitment. You are no longer trying to trigger jealousy. You are no longer trying to make them regret their decision. You simply refuse to remain in a relationship where your emotional security depends on someone else's willingness to participate. And this is where the avoidant may experience something unexpected. They may have wanted freedom from emotional pressure, but now they are confronted with freedom from you. Those are not the same thing. They wanted distance without necessarily understanding that distance has consequences. They wanted independence without realizing that independence can eventually produce separation. They wanted space without realizing that space can become permanent when trust is repeatedly damaged. And this is one of life's deeper principles. Every choice creates a direction. You cannot repeatedly choose distance and then demand closeness when the other person has learned to live without you. You cannot repeatedly reject connection and then expect connection to remain unchanged. You cannot keep teaching someone that they are unsafe with you and then become surprised when they stop opening their heart. That's not punishment. That's adaptation. People adapt to what they repeatedly experience. And perhaps the most powerful transformation occurs when you stop asking, how do I get them back? and start asking, why was I willing to abandon myself just to keep them? That question changes everything. Because once you understand your own patterns, you stop being fascinated by theirs. You stop trying to diagnose every withdrawal. You stop turning their behavior into a puzzle that you must solve. You stop believing that if you become more patient, more attractive, more understanding, more available, or more forgiving, you can finally earn the consistency you should never have had to beg for. You recognize that love is not supposed to be an audition. And if the person eventually comes back, the question isn't simply whether they miss you. The question is whether they have developed the capacity to treat you differently. Missing you is an emotion. Change is a behavior. Regret is a feeling. Accountability is a decision. And words are easy. Consistency is the evidence. So don't measure your progress by whether they return. Measure it by whether you have returned to yourself. Because when you no longer need someone to choose you in order to feel valuable, their decision loses the power to define your life. And that is the moment space becomes freedom. They thought distance would give them control, until your absence taught them that access to you was never guaranteed. And now we arrive at one of the deepest consequences of betrayal. Because sometimes the punishment isn't something another person gives you. Sometimes it is the psychological reality you have to live with after your own choices have changed the way you experience relationships. When an avoidant repeatedly creates distance, damages trust, or walks away from emotional responsibility, they may initially experience relief. The pressure is gone. The difficult conversation is over. The emotional intensity has disappeared. For a while, that can feel like freedom. But relief is not always peace. Sometimes relief is simply the temporary absence of discomfort. And when the distraction fades, reality has a way of becoming louder. You begin remembering the person you pushed away. You remember the opportunities you had to communicate differently. You remember the moments when they were trying to reach you and you responded with silence, defensiveness, or distance. You remember the conversations you avoided because they felt uncomfortable. And eventually, a difficult question can emerge. What if I was the one who destroyed something valuable? That question can be far more uncomfortable than any argument, because now there is no one else to blame. This is where regret becomes psychologically complicated. Regret isn't simply wishing the past had been different. It is recognizing that your own decisions contributed to a loss that cannot necessarily be reversed. And that recognition can create an emotional prison. Not because the person is literally trapped, but because their mind repeatedly returns to the same unresolved possibility. What if I had communicated? What if I had stayed? What if I had been honest? What if I had trusted instead of withdrawing? What if I had recognized their value before they stopped offering it? Those questions can become increasingly powerful when the person realizes that the relationship they once took for granted cannot simply be recreated on demand. And this is where comparison can begin. Future relationships may feel different. New people may not understand them in the same way. New connections may not carry the same history. New partners may not have the same patience. And suddenly, the qualities that once felt ordinary become extraordinary in hindsight. The person who was always there becomes the person who isn't. The person who always tried to communicate becomes the person who stopped explaining. The person who kept giving chances becomes the person who finally established a boundary. And hindsight has a strange way of changing perception. When something is available, we often evaluate it based on how it makes us feel today. When it is gone, we may evaluate it based on what it meant to us over time. That doesn't mean every avoidant person will regret their actions. And it doesn't mean every relationship should be restored. But it does reveal a broader truth about human behavior. Unresolved patterns eventually follow us. You can leave a relationship without leaving your patterns behind. You can move to another person and still carry the same fear of vulnerability. You can begin a new relationship and still retreat whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable. You can receive love and still sabotage it if you haven't examined why closeness feels threatening. And that is why the deepest consequence isn't simply losing one person. It is remaining the same person who keeps losing people for the same reason. That's the real prison. Because if you never confront the behavior that created the loss, the cycle continues. Connection begins, vulnerability increases, fear appears, distance follows, the other person becomes hurt, the relationship deteriorates. Then the avoidant experiences relief, and eventually loneliness. Then another connection begins, and the pattern repeats. This is why self-awareness matters so much. You cannot transform what you refuse to examine. And from your side, there is another lesson equally important. You do not need to become obsessed with whether they regret what they did. You don't need to monitor their social media. You don't need to ask mutual friends whether they're suffering. You don't need to construct imaginary scenarios where they finally understand everything. Because if your healing depends on their regret, you're still emotionally connected to the outcome. Your freedom begins when you realize that their internal consequences belong to them. Your responsibility is different. Your responsibility is to learn from what happened. Maybe you learned that chemistry isn't enough. Maybe you learned that potential isn't the same as character. Maybe you learned that understanding someone's wounds doesn't mean you should volunteer to be wounded by them. Maybe you learned that loving someone deeply does not mean ignoring what their behavior repeatedly communicates. Those lessons can become part of your strength, and perhaps the most important lesson is this: never confuse someone's emotional struggle with your obligation to tolerate emotional damage. You can have compassion without surrendering your standards. You can understand someone without excusing them. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. And you can wish someone well while choosing a completely different future for yourself. That is maturity. Because the ultimate victory isn't watching someone regret losing you. The ultimate victory is reaching a point where their regret is no longer necessary for you to move forward. Let them understand or misunderstand. Let them remember or forget. Let them regret or deny. Your life cannot remain suspended while another person decides what your worth means to them. You have a future to build, and the greatest response to betrayal is not revenge. It is becoming so emotionally grounded that the betrayal no longer determines who you become. The real prison is not losing someone. It is refusing to learn why you lost them. And this is where the entire story ultimately comes back to you, because the most powerful consequence of betrayal is not watching the other person suffer. It is discovering that you no longer need their behavior to determine the direction of your life. Think about that for a moment. You can spend months wondering whether they regret what they did. You can analyze their silence, interpret their social media activity, ask whether they miss you, and imagine what they might be thinking. But if your emotional state still depends on what they do next, then they still occupy the driver's seat in your life. And eventually, you have to take that seat back. Your transformation begins when you stop asking, how do I make them realize what they lost? And start asking, who am I becoming because of what I experienced? That is a completely different question. One keeps you psychologically attached to the past. The other moves you toward the future. Betrayal can make people bitter because they allow someone else's poor choices to become evidence that love itself is dangerous. They begin building walls. They become suspicious. They stop trusting. They convince themselves that emotional distance is safer than emotional connection. But that's not transformation. That's adaptation through fear. Real transformation means taking the lesson without carrying the poison. You can say, I will never tolerate that again, without saying, I will never love again. You can become more discerning without becoming cynical. You can strengthen your boundaries without becoming emotionally unavailable. You can become wiser without becoming colder. And that distinction matters because your goal isn't to become someone who cannot be hurt. Your goal is to become someone who can recognize what deserves access to your heart. There is enormous power in that. When you know your standards, you stop negotiating them every time you feel lonely. When you know your values, you stop abandoning them every time someone attractive gives you attention. When you know your worth, you stop trying to convince someone else to recognize it. And suddenly, the betrayal becomes part of your education instead of the definition of your identity. Maybe you once believed love meant staying no matter what. Now you understand that healthy love also requires boundaries. Maybe you once believed patience meant tolerating uncertainty indefinitely. Now you understand that patience without reciprocity becomes self-neglect. Maybe you once believed that if you loved someone enough, you could heal their fear of intimacy. Now you understand something far more empowering. You can support someone's growth, but you cannot do their inner work for them. That realization can change the way you approach every relationship from this point forward. You begin watching actions instead of becoming hypnotized by promises. You pay attention to consistency instead of occasional intensity. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop interpreting emotional chaos as proof of deep connection. And you stop believing that being chosen by someone else is the highest form of validation. Because it isn't. The highest form of validation is being able to look at your own life and know that you did not abandon yourself to keep someone else. That's strength. And here's something else that matters. Don't turn your growth into another performance for the person who betrayed you. Don't improve yourself so they will notice. Don't become successful so they'll regret losing you. Don't become happier so they will wonder how you moved on. Do those things because they are yours. Your health is yours.